It is difficult to imagine a world in which you don't have to pay rent, in which money doesn't determine your wealth, and in which you're not forced to work for someone else to get by. Capitalism is so pervasive, we take it as natural. Accordingly, most of our theories about the economy and society presume a capitalist world. In reality, however, capitalism is everything but natural. This week and next, we'll talk about capitalism, its margins, and its origins. Capitalism is also a social system because it differentiates society in a class of capital owners, the capitalist or bourgeoisie, and a working class or proletariat, which depends on the capitalist for income. This creates an inequality between capitalists and workers, not just with regard to their wealth, but also with regard to their power to affect their living conditions, which under capitalism depends on one's wealth. One man, one vote, but more dollars, more political influence and economic power. When talking about capitalism, we quickly come across the work of Karl Marx, one of the most controversial figures of the 19th century. Marx was one of the first scholars to describe capitalism as an economic and social system, and his theories have laid the foundation of modern sociology. Even critics of Marx cannot avoid to engage his theories and concepts. Where it gets more dicey are Marx's political beliefs. Besides being a widely respected academic, he was also a political radical that sought to organize the working class to seize the means of production from the capitalists and to create a society in which everyone would truly be equal, communism. A number of political movements have picked up on his ideas, and some have frankly perverted them. The most extreme example was Stalinism in the Soviet Union, which used Marx's ideas to justify a brutal dictatorship of a small party elite. Eastern Germany, where my parents lived, was also ruled under similar ideas, which put my parents as practicing Christians in conflict with the state. It took me a moment to wrap my head around the fact that my parents were indoctrinated with Marx against their will, and now I am in the United States, the number one enemy of the Soviet Union and former East Germany, learning and teaching about Marx. It makes sense though, because Marx's original ideas had little to do with what the Soviet Union made out of them, decades after his death. A few years ago, I asked my mom whether she regards me as a traitor because I am voluntarily learning about Marx despite coming from a family that was oppressed by a socialist state. She told me that they always knew that Marx had it right on many points, and that a truly classless society would be a wonderful goal. But if you had used Marx to point out inequality in East Germany, you would have been put in prison. So perhaps it is incumbent on us now to use our freedom of speech to critically engage with the work of Karl Marx. Use it where appropriate and critique it where we must. Now let's return to capitalism. Central to it is what Marx described as the capitalist mode of production, the way goods and services are produced and distributed under capitalism. In a nutshell, the capitalist mode of production presumes that the inputs of a productive process are privately owned as commodities. Using means of production, such as tools, machines, and land, these inputs are then transformed by human labor, which workers exert in exchange for a wage. The output of this process is another commodity that is then sold for money. One of the defining features of this capitalist mode of production is that the value produced by the workers exceeds the value of the labor necessary to produce the final commodity. But this surplus value is not returned to the workers who produced it, but pocketed by their employers. They have the power to do so because they own the means of production. Without these means of production, the workers can't do anything, not even produce the things necessary for their survival. In consequence, they accept any arrangement that keeps them alive, however exploitive. The ownership over the means of production is what makes a capitalist a capitalist. How then do the capitalists come to own the means of production? Within the capitalist mode of production, they typically reinvest the surplus value produced in the productive process to increase their productive capital, that is their stock of means of production. In this arrangement, capitalists accumulate capital while the workers merely get by. There's a lot to be said about the capitalist mode of production. Is it fair? Is it sustainable? Does it satisfy human needs and protect human rights? These are central concerns of sociology and economics, but they are not our questions today. It is only worth our time to ask such questions if we can think of capitalism as human-made rather than natural, something that could look differently if it was assembled differently. If the linchpin of the capitalist mode of production is the fact that an elite exclusively owns the means of production, we should ask, how did we get here? Ownership over means of production has not always been so unevenly distributed. For much of human history, There was inequality, but most people had access to what they needed to survive, such as land and tools. So when and why did that change? This is the question of primitive or original accumulation. How were some people able to accumulate ownership rights over means of production so that others could no longer survive on their own? In 1776, Adam Smith, the founder of modern economics, described primitive accumulation as the result of some people working more diligently than others. Over time, they were then able to accumulate wealth in the form of capital. To this day, this narrative is at the heart of the supporters of capitalism. We learn it every day. Work a little harder and eventually you'll make it. There's only one problem with that narrative. It is a myth. It is a myth that bears no semblance with reality. Not only are there lots of people who work hard but never make it, Smith's story is also historically inaccurate. In the 27th chapter of Das Kapital, Karl Marx describes graphically how capital was first accumulated in England, the birthplace of modern capitalism. Accumulating ownership over the means of production had little to do with the amount of work people performed. Instead, it was the result of violent dispossession. Backed by the state, local feudal elites removed the peasants from the land and turned common pastures into their private property. They let some of the peasants come back, but not as free, autonomous people, but as tenants and dependent workers. This history is important because it doesn't only show how free peasants turned into dependent workers, a process called proletarianization, but also how common goods become private property or commodities. Nothing in this world is a tradable commodity until someone makes it a commodity, usually by excluding others from access to that thing. This process is known as enclosure of commons. Marx's account of primitive accumulation in England is quite a fascinating read that I recommend you have a look at. I listed it as supplementary reading for this week. So what has primitive accumulation to do with rural sociology today? For me, there are three main reasons. First, to be able to imagine alternatives to capitalism, or even imagine a better capitalism, we need to understand it as a result of social action, something that could be different if people acted differently. For that, it is important to understand it as a historical process, rather than a naturally given fact. Second, primitive accumulation is such an important concept because it explains so many facets of modern society, many of which squarely affect the core of rural sociology. Why do people work for wages? Why is farmland a tradable commodity? Why is wealth so unevenly distributed? Urbanization, which we discussed a few weeks ago, is directly related to these phenomena because it is a result of people no longer being able to live on the land they once owned, which made them dependent on gainful employment that they could only find in cities. The third reason why primitive accumulation still matters today is that it's far from over. To this day, in America and across the world, collective owners of common goods are being dispossessed in new rounds of primitive capitalist accumulation. I return to these ongoing examples of primitive accumulation later in the lecture. Okay, let's summarize what we learned so far. Primitive accumulation describes the process by which non-capitalist entities are brought under the rule of capitalism. Only once things, beings, and entities become commodities, they can be traded and produced according to the rules of the capitalist mode of production. And only after people get dispossessed of their means to subsist, do they become desperate enough to enter the capitalist mode of production as wage workers. These workers then produce wealth, of which only a fraction is returned to them as a wage, and the remainder flows to the owners of the means of production, the capitalists. The capitalists accumulate capital over time, which creates a society of two classes, the capitalists and the workers. This is Capitalism 101. Before I move on to describe how this process of primitive accumulation relates to economic development today in the United States, I ask you to take a quick break, stretch, and return to the second half of the lecture when you're ready.